Hello, my name's James, and today I'm going to talk about storytelling. But before I do that, to begin this presentation, I'm going to ask you to quickly think about three things. First, I'd like you to think of the best story you've ever heard or read. It could be a fairy tale, a tragedy, a comedy. Anything is okay. Next, I'm going to ask you to think about the best storyteller you've ever met, seen, or heard. This could be an author, a family member, or a friend. Again, anyone is okay. Finally, I want you to think about how you felt when you were listening to your favorite story or storyteller. Of course, it's impossible for me to gauge your reactions when my presentation is being done online like this, but I have asked a lot of people, including my students, these questions before, and there are a few common reactions. When I ask people about their favorite stories, they usually look a little confused and undecided, and understandably so. There are so many great stories and tales. How can we choose just one so quickly? Then, when I ask them about their favorite storytellers, the looks of indecision often turn to smiles. That's oftentimes a much easier one to answer and is strongly connected to the final question, how they felt. When I ask for specific details on this, the responses usually include feelings like excited, fascinated, terrified, warm, loved. While these emotions vary greatly, they do all have one thing in common. They demonstrate that the listeners were deeply engaged. That level of engagement is something that we as teachers often crave in our classrooms. And it's something that I wanted to try to replicate in my courses. So, in this presentation, I'll start by briefly discussing what a story is. Then I'll move on to the theory and research supporting the inclusion of storytelling in courses, especially in tertiary education. Then I'll talk about some of the barriers we encounter that stop teachers from using storytelling. Finally, I'd like to share some of the ways that I've used storytelling and how I managed to incorporate it into my courses. So, for the first question, what is a story? Before we look at what a story is, let's look at what it isn't. A story isn't a case study. Case studies incorporate these factors, and they're very useful in practice-based courses like Business English. However, the focus on facts, data, and figures doesn't really give students the opportunity to communicate freely and openly. They're a bit restrictive. Stories are also not scenarios. Again, scenarios are very useful tools for eliciting students' opinions, and they are very effective in developing critical thinking skills and also negotiating skills as students search for the best possible solutions together. However, they tend to focus solely on emotion, and that's at the expense of reason. So, stories can be seen as a combination of case studies and scenarios in their descriptions of sequences of real or imaginary decisions, and they engage both reason and emotion. Now, that's what a story is. So, moving on to the second question, why should we use storytelling? There are a lot of answers to this question, and they cover a range of different themes. So I group them into four main categories: education and learning, communication and relationships, self-development, and employability. While some of the reasons fit into more than one of these categories, I've tried to collate them into sets of best fit. So let's go into more detail and look at each of those sets and the reasons within them. I've included the references on the slides, but I can also provide you with a full list so that they can be reviewed and you can look into them in more depth if you want to. Just email me if you'd like a copy of that list. In terms of the benefits for education and learning, storytelling has been shown to be effective in promoting both performance and learning motivations. So not only do students communicate more effectively, they also want to engage with English and their learning more. That really is a significant finding, as we all want our students to improve, but to do that while also boosting motivations to learn is a situation of killing two birds with one stone. Also, like many other task-based learning activities, students need to develop their own work actively and autonomously. That brings a range of benefits, such as building a sense of ownership over their work, which enhances feelings of pride and achievement. It also develops critical thinking skills as students work together and question the ways in which they develop their stories. Working autonomously also facilitates a move away from students depending on their teachers. While that can make us feel less needed as educators, it really is the end goal of our classes, helping the students reach a place where they can produce language and recall the necessary knowledge to interact effectively without having their teacher with them. It also enables students to make sense of their own knowledge and experiences. There's a wealth of understanding that we already have present in our minds, but a lot of it remains inaccessible without active processing. Storytelling is one way that the wide range of inputs we take in every day can be filtered and sorted into chunks that we can then put into effective use. Not only can students process that dormant knowledge and consolidate understanding, but they can also use it actively in a communicative manner in order to achieve authentic goals, such as the transmission of ideas, through the telling of their stories and the negotiations entered into when developing stories together with others. Working towards authentic goals increases motivation, as achieving them becomes more desirable and meaningful. It also improves effective expression and communicative competence as students ensure their goals, including the successful conveyance of meaning, are reached. By reviewing concepts and materials previously covered in their courses in the process of developing their stories, students can strengthen and consolidate those concepts and also make new connections between ideas. It also requires students to reflect more deeply about the course materials and their own learning, which is something that I've often found it difficult to encourage in my classes. So, as we've seen, storytelling can have a positive impact on the consolidation of understanding of ideas and knowledge that has been introduced in courses. But more than this, as it combines cognitive and emotional knowledge, it also enables better understanding of behavior, both that of ourselves and other people. The combination of cognitive and emotional knowledge also encourages learning that's transferable, reflective, and fluid in nature. Another factor that's really important, and one that I really can't stress enough, is that storytelling provides students with a space and opportunity to express genuine feelings. That's something that the vast majority of in-class interactions don't do. As well as the benefits that this brings for students, that I will touch on briefly later, this is very important for educators, as it gives us the chance to examine what students are really thinking. That then allows us to understand students' true emotional states, so that we can then provide more suitable courses and, where possible, offer better pastoral care, support, and career advice. Finally, incorporating storytelling into our courses adds an extra tool that we can call on, an extra string to our pedagogical bows, and that adds depth to the courses that we provide. So, we've covered the first group of reasons why storytelling is a valuable asset and tool to be used in courses. The second group is communication and relationships. Before we talk about that again, I'd like to ask you to think of a conversation you've had recently. Think about what you actually said and how it all panned out. If you're sitting down and having a chat with someone, it isn't like the majority of interactions that get modeled in classrooms. It isn't a series of questions and answers. You share experiences and ideas, which is basically the essence of storytelling. that supports the idea that storytelling is a fundamental aspect of human interaction. That leads on to the idea that storytelling utilizes the social element of language, and that is something that's very important. Communication is an inherently social act, and promoting that in our classrooms is important. Storytelling is a great way of doing that for a lot of reasons. Some of these include sharing of knowledge, which enables shared meanings to be co-constructed, the building of community within a classroom, and the enhanced understanding of classmates that encourages. As I mentioned earlier, storytelling allows genuine values, emotions, and beliefs to be expressed, and that can help students realize that they're not alone and that their experiences are not isolated events. Depending on the age of the students we're teaching, that can have really serious implications. Also important in the development of communication and relationships is the idea that students work together on writing their stories. By doing this, they can create a collective text, and that can lead to a mutual feeling of accomplishment. Also, on the way to achieving that, the students develop their team working skills. So, moving on now to self-development. By covering a wide range of contexts and our responses to them, the introduction of storytelling improves self-awareness and cultural knowledge and allows students to explore the many representations of our worlds. This then enables students to deal with unexpected situations and consider the possibilities of what may happen in various situations. When students realize that they can cope with and communicate effectively in different situations, and also that they're able to successfully create stories that convey meaning and ideas, this helps establish self-confidence. Enhanced self-confidence is a major factor which feeds into the willingness to communicate model, which is a predictor of how many interactions students will take part in and practice using their communication skills in, which ultimately leads to greater communicative competence. The final group of reasons relates to employability. The implementation of storytelling allows theory to be linked to practice, as the ideas and concepts from classroom materials are contextualized by either students' real-life experiences or imaginary scenarios that they've created based on them. As new students enroll, this allows courses to remain up to date and not rely on course books that can soon become outdated. It also allows more credible and reasonable perceptions of authentic workplaces to be gained. I work in the tourism and the business management faculty, and many tourism students worldwide have very unrealistic expectations of what working in the tourism industry is actually like. Linking the ideas from the classroom to real stories that people have experienced can act as a way of removing the rose-tinted glasses that sometimes get worn when viewing service industries such as this. Connected to this is also the idea that students not only get to understand the industry better, but they also know what skills will be needed to become successful in that industry. A final but important point connected to employability is that through the group work involved in developing stories with classmates, students learn how to manage their behavior and build relationships with other people in order to reach their targets. The managing of behaviors in this way encourages the development of emotions that they will be expected to display in the workplace, such as concern and empathy. I've covered in some more detail now why we should use storytelling in our courses. From that information, it would seem pretty cut and dried that we should all be using storytelling in every class, right? So why don't we? A major point is that for some courses, it just isn't a suitable approach. If you're teaching an exam preparation course, the incorporation of storytelling just isn't going to work unless it's an anecdote about the best ways of using test-taking techniques. This seems fairly obvious to say, but each course needs to be tailored to the needs of the students, the strengths of the teacher, and the educational ethos of the institute. There are some cases where storytelling just doesn't fit. It can appear daunting and overwhelming for students. While I'm more than happy to produce a story in English based on my experiences and thoughts, if I was asked to do that in Japanese, I'd find it a lot harder to achieve. This can lead to effective filters being raised and students setting up defensive mechanisms to avoid feelings of inadequacy. There are also time constraints, both in terms of how storytelling can be fitted into class time and how teachers will have the chance to check and provide feedback on student stories. Connected to the point about storytelling not being suited to some contexts, there's often a focus on exams or other outcomes that can mean that teachers don't want to deviate from the tried and tested methods that they've used before. This also leads into the next point, which is that there are times when the potential benefits of trialing and implementing a new approach are viewed as not worth the effort needed. Let's face it, it's always easier to stay doing what we're doing and maintain the status quo than stirring things up a bit and opening the door to possible failures that may reflect badly on ourselves or our schools and universities. This leads to a situation where educators play it safe, which storytelling definitely doesn't do. That's because storytelling and the stories that get developed and told are unpredictable. They could all be great and the students could do really well, but some of the stories could also be a bit damp, or even worse, offensive or inappropriate. Personally though, I view that last point as a positive. It's the unpredictability that makes it one of my favorite approaches. While teachers can guide students, the stories are their own, and that unpredictability is exciting. Let's get into the final stage of this presentation, how I used storytelling in my classes. It wasn't easy to begin with, and it's taken a lot of tweaking and refinement. But the courses in which I now use storytelling as the main method follow this procedure. There are 7 steps and each one takes a different amount of time, and teachers need to be flexible with how long they spend on each one. That of course depends on the students you're teaching and how much input you want to include. I'll quickly take you through what I do. The first stage is to introduce stories and discuss them. I often use stories relating to problems tourists encounter when on vacation, as they're relevant to the courses and students that I teach. Once the stories have been read and meaning checked, we discuss them based on 4 basic responses: a viewpoint response, a wonder-if response, a similar response, and a what learned response. There are a lot of different ways to organize this discussion process, but I tend to do it in 3 stages. First, the students are divided into groups. They then discuss one of the responses. For example, Group A would talk about a viewpoint response, Group B, a wonder-if response, and so on. After a set amount of time, they then form new groups with students who have not discussed the same responses. They then report what they discussed and talk about each response in more detail. In the 3rd stage, they return to their first group and report on the discussions they had in stage 2. While there are a lot of different ways of undertaking this step, I feel that this is the best way to optimize exposure to different opinions and ideas, and also to get the students working with lots of different group members. Once different stories have been introduced and discussed, the next step is to give the students the building blocks they need to construct their own stories. These are the different components of stories. Again, there are lots of different ways of doing this, and it depends on the teacher and level of students as to how much detail you will want to go into. But the essentials include structure, key factors such as characters and context, and also the linguistic devices that students will need to write their stories and connect their ideas coherently. I also like to introduce the 20 master plots outlined by Tobias, as this supports students' story building and gives them some scaffolding, or at least a base to build from. The rest of the process is contained within these 5 steps. Again, there are lots of different ways to approach the different steps. For example, whether students can choose their own groups, they're put into groups, or they're chosen randomly. How long the stories need to be and how they should be formatted. How feedback is provided, and whether that's teacher feedback, peer feedback, or a combination of the two. Whether revisions are done individually or as groups, and whether the story should be submitted in written form, recorded form, or performed live in front of classmates. Each of these variations has their own positives and negatives, but I've found that if the 7 steps I presented earlier are followed, the introduction of storytelling tends to run smoothly and can provide a lot of benefits to students. So, the last thing to say is that if you found this presentation interesting or useful, I'm always happy to discuss this topic with people. So, do feel free to use the email address on the opening slide to contact me. I'll also happily send you a list of the references I used. So, thanks for watching, and please do give storytelling a try. It really is worth it.